And welcome back. Recently, more than 1,000 delegates and religious leaders from different faiths converged in Johannesburg in an effort to address the social and moral crisis state of South Africa. This gathering coincided with the release of the Stats SA's 2022 census results. Against that backdrop, we delve deeper into a conversation around the challenges affecting the country. We are joined by Eddie Rakabe, who is a senior researcher specializing in political economy at the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection, Reverend Mzwandile Molo, who formed part of the organizing team of the Interfaith Forum South Africa, and Professor Julian from the University of the Western Cape, who also sits on the National Planning Commission. Good morning to all of you, and thank you so much for making time for us. Professor May, let's start off with you. The question that we're asking this morning to our audience is what or how would they describe the state of South Africa based on the research that has been done by the National Planning Commission and the 10-year review as well. How would you describe the state of South Africa?
There are concerns that we have in the Planning Commission, and the census has somewhat borne out some of those concerns. We've also made some progress, and some important progress as well. Let me start with the concerns. For the Planning Commission, probably the biggest concern is the fact that we have had very slow growth in South Africa, sometimes negative growth when we take into account the increase of the population, and that has resulted in the tremendous increase and continual high numbers of people who are unemployed. Unless we address the problem of growth generating and unemployment reduction, we are going to have difficulty in attaining the goals of the NDP by 2030. That doesn't mean that we should give up on those goals. Those targets are absolutely essential. We need to be committed towards moving towards those goals. The census showed us that the huge movement of our population from rural to urban between provinces, and as well as the growth of the population. Once again, that's positive in many ways. That means that we've managed to increase our life expectancy and a very successful rollout of HIV/AIDS treatment. But it also signals that people are able now to move to where they feel they can find employment. Again, the delivery of that employment is critical. And then finally, before I leave this question, the last issue would be the improvement in the delivery of services, which indicates that people have access to those services, but again, critical is whether they can afford them and whether those services are of adequate quality. Again, we are seeing other results that suggest that things like the quality of our water, the consistency of our electricity supply, all of those are of concern and hinder our ability to achieve the targets of the NDP.
Yeah. And Eddie, when we look at the Indlulamiti scenarios, they currently say that we are in a Gwara state. And one of the authors who are part of the Indlulamiti committee is saying that we are teetering very closely to becoming a failed state. Do you still hold that view, considering the outcomes of this census?
Yeah, good morning. Good morning, Aaron. Good morning to the listeners. Well, we're actually working now on the Indlulamiti 2035 scenarios, which are now looking at new scenarios. So the question about a failed state, whether we are teetering towards a failed state, I don't think what the census data has actually revealed is really anything near close to a failed state, because what it essentially shows, especially from the perspective of access to basic services, is that about 80% of the population have got access to basic services, to water, for instance. We've got 90% of population have got access to electricity. 80% again have got access to basic sanitation. Now, South Africa is a country in transition. So as a country in transition, we're going to experience negative economic outcomes. We're going to experience positive economic outcomes. So the question is whether the positive outweighs the negative. And what the census reveals, and at an average level, is that the positive, at least from the census perspective, is that the positive outweighs the negatives. I think the issue there is that with this increased access to basic services does not necessarily mean that people have got access to basic services. And what the Human Rights Commission has actually revealed on last Monday with the report in Limpopo is that quite a number of people in that province actually still struggle with access to services, despite the fact that the census says there's 80% access to electricity, which means that we need to be looking at what happens at the municipality level once the resources are being given to these municipalities, whether the services actually get to the people.
Yeah, and Reverend Molo, the point that Eddie raises there brings us to the question around the capacity of the state and whether the state does have the capability. One of our listeners or viewers this morning responding to the question that we're asking about how they would describe the state of the nation, saying that while there is an issue around capacity, capacity is very different to capability, and that is the issue that we need to deal with as a country.
Thank you very much, Adrian, and greetings to your listeners. I want to state as our point of entry in this conversation, Adrian, that when we met as the TIFs are convening, the stats was released on the second day of our convening. So part of this engagement in trying to relate what we said to the stats is one that we still need to concentrate on. But answering your question, the reality is that there is data that has come to the stats, and we appreciate that, but sometimes there is a disconnect between what the data says to us and what people experience on the ground. And throughout that convening, there was a deep sense in the people that the state itself, either through corruption, through incapability, through lack of commitment to the needs of our people, have left ordinary people, left them out in the continued journey of the country. And the experience is that the state, in many ways, is not present in their struggles for life and life of dignity in their communities. And they have therefore said to themselves, it looks like the state is giving up its responsibility, sometimes to private interest, as it seeks then to absolve itself of these responsibilities. The examples were made of things like when the state allows or takes, for example, police stations and allow those police stations to be guarded by private security, whilst it is supposed to be the safest place in society. Things like that indicate for us that the state is finding a way to absolve itself of these basic services that it needs to provide to its people, including on these key elements that we talk about today. And indeed, we want to say that the capability of the state and the commitment to deliver services might be matched by what people experience on the ground. And the experience we have during that convening is that people are feeling disenchanted from the state, and much more dangerously, are feeling disenchanted from their own ability to make the state do what the state needs to do. And therefore, there's a lot of anger in society. That capability must translate into the state being expelled by the people on the ground. Otherwise, it appears to be stats on paper, and our people don't experience the transformative power of the state within those communities.
And Professor May, your 10-year review report looking at the district development model says that if you look at where it has been piloted in Waterberg, OR Tambo, as well as at eThekwini, it doesn't appear to respond adequately to the key issues facing municipalities. Where is the link that we are missing here when it comes to what is intended with the district development model and what people on the ground are actually experiencing?
It also comes back to how our municipalities implement their integrated development plans. And I think the experience varies tremendously across South Africa. There are municipalities that do well, that have the capacity to be able to deal with the integrated development plans. And if those then are linked up with those of neighboring municipalities, then the district development model can work. It can allow for a smoother planning, for better distribution of resources, and also collaboration between municipalities to be able to achieve the targets that they've set themselves. But where you have weak capacity, then a district development model is unlikely to be able to deliver, because you're simply adding one weak municipality to another. You're probably stretching their ability to be able to plan properly, and of concern is you may be distancing them from the communities that they are supposed to serve. So exactly as Reverend Molo has mentioned, that means that the state becomes absent. People are unable to see how the state is assisting them, and then they will become disillusioned again, as was said. So the district development model can contribute, but it is about how it's used in combination with other kinds of planning instruments that are available in South Africa, like our National Spatial Development Framework.
Yeah. Eddie, on the question around transparency, as well as making sure that the state actually does achieve what has been promised to the people, one of the points that's raised also in the 10-year review of the National Planning Commission is that Of the 20 key SOEs, only 2 SOEs got clean audits. Of the 257 municipalities, only 36 got clean audits. What needs to happen here?
Yeah, well, I think what Professor Mays indicated is that there is institutional failure within some of these state-owned entities and state institutions. And institutional failure implies many things. It means there's a failure of leadership, there's a failure of systems, there's a failure of processes. Now, there is a legislation that is put in place, to be used when there's this type of systemic failure within the state, and one of which is intervention. So the Constitution makes provision for Section 100. The Municipal Management Act makes provision for Section 139, through which the MECs and the ministers can actually intervene in some of these underperforming SOEs. But unfortunately, intervention, it has proven very politically difficult. We've had some municipalities which has been placed under administration for over 2 years, and even when after the elapse of that intervention, there is no improvement, which suggests that the problem is much more systemic. It means it needs really a type of system and system intervention, process intervention within those municipalities. It has also proven very difficult in some of these SOEs. I mean, we've seen board being changed over and over again. So there is no consistency in how we intervene, which means that we need a framework which actually outline how an intervention is going to improve the situation within the SOE or failing municipalities. And currently, unfortunately, we do not have such framework. We have piecemeal intervention, which is not necessarily is not uniform in the way in which we intervene, and as a result, we're not seeing an improvement in the performance of the SOEs. And coupled with that, I mean, we've had issues about the perceptions of political intervention in some of these municipalities. Those are the type of challenges that cannot be resolved through mechanical interventions, where you just put an administrator in a municipality and hope that they're going to improve the situation. It's a challenge that has to be resolved at a political level. So at a political level. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and Reverend Molo, we expect the medium-term budget policy statement to be delivered on the 1st of November. Some of the issues that have been raised before is that it seems that though that the South African government has taken an austerity measure approach when it comes to the allocation of budgets, but yet we see on the other hand, Census is telling us that we actually have a growing population, and amongst the people who are contributing to the growth of this population are also foreign nationals. How do we deal with this?
The reality is that South Africa must make serious, hard choices here. The past 30 years, somebody has paid for the democratic transition of the last 30 years. And at the core of that payment has been the poor in society, who had to carry, in our view, an unfair burden of being sacrificed as an offering to secure the South African transition into a place where we are now living relatively without uprisings, without disruptions. We are saying, and everybody who spoke in that conference says, there's a need now for us to have a direction from the fiscal policy, from the economic policies we took, from private money to all of us. We must find an architecture that makes of all of us say, what are the costs and benefits of the sacrifices we must all pay in order to transit our country from this moment of deep unrest, of this distrust, and of deep disenchantment with an economic system that has not included the majority of our people. Government must lead in that serious conversation with business and private society, where we transfer, Adrian, not simply money from people to other. We transfer what we call resources that allow people to live dignified lives. And if our government is going to pursue a journey towards austerity where the poor are sacrificed, so that to make sure that the piecemeal transitions that are taking place are maintained, it's dangerous. Our people are tired of being excluded from their economic life of dignity. we must all therefore sit around and ask ourselves, what are the economic hard decisions that need to be taken without sacrificing the poor? We must make sure that those who are at the top end of society, who must pay their fair share of taxation that allows us to invest in the country, but also for government to say, how do we share the load of making sure that South Africans are included? And that means allowing those who are included in the past to feel that they are part of this transition, inclusive of what you're talking of the medium term, that the minister is going to put before us. And if it sacrifices the poor, it is a dangerous thing that that government is playing, and we're all going to pay a high price, which we should not be.
Yeah, and Professor May, from the work that you have done as well, again, looking at how do we balance the two? Because on the one end, the government is saying that we don't have enough money to spend, but then on the other end, you have people who are part of the advisory council, the economic advisory council of the president. We spoke to Dr. Tabi Lyoka some time ago, and she said that unfortunately sometimes what happens is that the recommendations and proposals that are made to the government never really get implemented.
Key here is going to be the prioritization that Reverend Molo has mentioned. At the University of Western Cape, I lead a Centre of Excellence in Food Security, and one of the areas of research that we are focused on in terms of prioritizing is that of the situation of South Africa's children. What we are calling for is that we need to place children at the center of our planning. And that means when we make austerity choices, when we have to make decisions about where we spend money or not, my first question would be, how is this going to affect future generations? It means rather than adopting an austerity measure that is simply across the board, we need to decide what are the things that are essential and in fact we might need to increase expenditure on. I would say, for an example, the health and nourishment of children, and what are the things that we can do without, or we can look for other partners. And here, for example, one of the things we can do, and I think we are already starting to move towards, is how do we address our energy problem? Here, this is a place where the private sector has the resources, has an interest in investing, and in fact would be able to deliver efficient and renewable energy if they are given the opportunities to do. Fortunately, we are making positive steps in that direction. So like I say, it's the trade-off. Where do we need to increase investments? And that exactly is making sure we do not leave the poor behind, particularly poor children, particularly poor undernourished children. And where do we involve and support the investment by others who would be able to generate an income from that investment while benefiting the country?
Okay, just quickly, as we close up the conversation, I've got two questions, but in quick succession, we're going to start off with you, Eddie. The question number one, the role of the media and where the media could be failing in the democratic dispensation and also holding the government accountable. Of course, there are some strides that we have made as the media and also exposing some corruption, but also the relationship that South Africa has in the geopolitics that is currently playing out with various states. Eddie, let's start off with you and then we'll go to the other panel.
No, thanks, Andrew. I think the media can only so much. I mean, we've had a number of stories that has been of corruption that has been exposed through the media. It's a question of what happens after these stories have been exposed. Do we have the institutions of a justice system that actually that is working to make sure that the stories that have been broken through the media are being followed and people are being prosecuted for the wrongdoing that have committed? Now, with respect to the geopolitical position, I think I'll talk to it from an economic perspective. I think when we're really seeing huge geopolitical tensions around the world, and South Africa has taken a position against the weak. They say we are going to stand with the people who are being deprived of their freedom, their democracy, because of the experience that we've had. We sympathize with the people that are now. But unfortunately, it comes at a cost because we have got trading partners that are actually are friends to some of the people that we are sympathizing. We are not sympathizing with, and that may come at a cost economically as the economic relations intensifies.
Thank you, Professor Molo.
You say Professor?
Sorry, I meant Reverend Molo.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you for giving me professorship, Adrian, on national television. The media has a very critical role in the building of our country. And I just want to pivot to one area that we spend a lot of time on in that convening, that of building what we call a common South African consciousness that allows us to work together, because we are going to have differences. We are going to have different policy choices. We are going to have different ideological positions we take on these matters. Can the media help contribute to what Dr. Juma from Kenya referred to, a psychological architecture that builds a consensus of who we are and what we want to be? What Mbeta said, an understanding of where we want to go as a country. And how does the media then build that up so that we have values of respect, love, solidarity, all honesty, transparency, all those values are permeated beyond political interest, beyond class interest, so that society is able to build a psychological architecture that helps us then hold each other accountable, that helps us aspire to a better future. And the media plays a very important role, which must be expanded to the artists of the country, to the poets of the country, to the musicians of the country, so that we're able to project ourselves. The geopolitical positions are such that we must always be able to amplify the voice of the powerless. And therefore, whatever the powerful in the world wants us to beat us into to cohesion to their narratives, we must always resist that, because the poor and the marginalized in the world needs any voice and every voice that can be heard and shared for the purpose of their own dignity.
Professor May, your quick take on those two questions.
I think the media can play an essential role by raising people's awareness, by doing essentially also the role that some parts of the media played during the apartheid years, which exposed the problems which are taking place, even often at the risk of those journalists that were doing the work. I think that's very much a really important role for the media to play.
And on geopolitics?
On geopolitics, I watched the earlier part of the news when you first joined us with a sense of horror, because it's a deep concern as to how these conflicts are spilling over and ultimately affect people in our own country. We saw that with the Ukraine war, and I fear we will see it with what's happening in Gaza.
Thank you so much for your time. That is Professor Julian May, National Planning Commissioner there, also joined by Reverend Mzwandile Molo, who is from the Interfaith Forum of South Africa, and we're also joined by Eddie Rakabe and Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection. Thank you so much all for the time.